Brrr. Basketball, basketball, basketball. Ugh. We saying that L a lot. Now, to preface this, my training is in theater criticism and analysis. That is where my expertise lies, and I have over a decade of reviewing theatrical productions under my belt. So, I'm going to let folks who are more qualified to discuss cinematography, shot composition, lighting, sound, mixing, etc., do all of that.
It stinks.
Now, what I am trained to do is to analyze narrative, theme, plot, acting, structure. The language in film and theater do share roots, so I'm going to be directing my focus to discussing those, as well as the broader socioeconomic context this film finds itself landing in, that has mainly been created by the people who produced this movie. So, a quick plot discussion before we dig into the nitty gritty. The film follows the misadventures of washed up basketball coach Gibson, played by director Jeremy Boring. Having fallen from his glory days as a high school championship winning coach, he now finds himself in the middle of a divorce, as well as 15 years away from the high point of his life. The third time that he led his team to win the Tennessee State High School Basketball Championships. So, after a minor incident with some of his current students in 2023, Gibson finds himself fired and in need of a new job. He decides to go to his last place of employment, formerly known as Compact Disc Forever. The place has now rebranded itself as The Dollhouse, a bar that is serviced by drag queens and cross-dressers. And I do mean, the kind of cross-dresser who doesn't shave but enjoys wearing women's clothes, the kind who keeps hitting you up on Grindr. In other words, the Daily Wire's most extreme idea of what trans women really are. After his first day, Gibson runs into one of his former students, one Alex Cruz, played by Daniel Considine, whose IMDb photo has the biggest porn stash I have ever seen, who is one of the cross-dressing wait staff of the Dollhouse. The two of them share drinks and commiserate about their former glory days and how it sucks that they're now washed up. Gibson eventually decides to enter Cruz in a citywide track and field competition, which advertises itself as having prize money of up to $5,000 per heat. On the day of the competition, Cruz shows up in a blonde wig, having just completed his shift at the Dollhouse, and Gibson attempts to register Cruz in the men's tournaments, but they have all been filled up. Cruz then shows up still wearing the wig, and the woman running the registrations mistakes Cruz for a trans woman.
I couldn't find my wipes.
Oh my crap, you're a trans woman.
And signs Cruz up in the women's categories. Of course, there were no hormone or endocrine tests being run, this being a local city competition. Cruz, despite having not done any training or preparation in the 15 years since he played high school basketball, handily dominates all the women's categories. Now, I can't tell if this is supposed to be pro or anti-woman at this point. A local news reporter, played by right-wing YouTuber Billy Ray, frames Cruz's victories as a trans woman winning these local competitions. So as Cruz and Gibson split the prize money, the reporter, Gwen Wild, confronts them, revealing that she knows Cruz is not trans and that she wants to use Gibson and Cruz to ride a wave of sports reporting to national prominence. Now, Gibson and Cruz are initially reluctant, but Wild blackmails them into agreeing to going along with her plan. The next portion is the getting the band back together bit of the film. Gibson recruits his former basketball players, starting with David Cohn, played by David Cohn, brothers Blaine and Jake Cran, played by Blaine and Jake Crane. Did they run out of name ideas? As well as the team's old towel boy, Felix Van Wyck. Van Wyck? Van Wyck? Whatever, Felix Van Wyck, I guess, played by Tyler Fisher. Gibson then reveals his plan to them to have the team pose as trans women and compete for the opportunity to represent the United States at the upcoming global games. I suppose there's some legal reason for not saying Olympics. I don't know. So we get a quick montage of Gibson's team, the eponymous Lady Ballers, crushing all of the women athletes they compete against, as well as each of the individual team members who are getting sponsorships and fame and social media recognition. So during all of this, Cruz has been quietly intimating that they might actually be trans for real, but it is constantly ignored and brushed over by everybody else. Eventually, Gibson's team makes it to the final qualification round, but the coach of the opposing team has gotten wise to Gibson's ruse and has also populated his own basketball team with cis men who for some reason are all black. And the Lady Ballers eventually lose, decide to come clean about their deception, and the movie ends, basically. All right, character analysis. Let's start with Coach Ron Gibson, or Rob Gibson. Rob Gibson. So forgettable. He's the closest thing the show has to a protagonist. It is Gibson's point of view that we follow throughout the film, and Gibson's who the bulk of the events happen to. Now, for a protagonist, he's extremely passive. Throughout the show, Gibson never truly takes an active role in what he's doing, but he's always either reacting or going along with whatever falls into his lap. He arrives at the location of his former CD shop. He finds that it's a drag bar and he kind of just goes along with it when the woman hires him. He isn't aware of the fact that the city is holding the sports tournament, even though he's a high school coach. You'd think he'd be plugged in. And even when he arrives to register Alex, he doesn't choose to pretend Alex is a trans woman. The registrar is the one who mistakes Alex Cruz for a trans woman, and he just kind of goes along with it.
Here you go, miss. This is everything you need for the women's heptathlon and all other events. And you know what? I'm just gonna go ahead and waive that entry fee. It is so wonderful what you're doing.
No, I'm not. I'm just glad we were able to get this worked out without having to get social media involved.
He doesn't actively rebuff Chris, who is dating his ex-wife, despite being shown to be very uncomfortable around him. When the plot to field this team of faux trans women is hatched by Wilde, the reporter, he has to be pushed into agreeing. Even in bed, or the aftermath of being in bed, as shown with Wilde, Gibson is shown to be the submissive in the relationship. He's the one tied up in the bed, he's the one getting whipped with the riding crop, he's the one taking orders. From a conservative point of view, this man would be the biggest soy boy you've ever met. He can't even muster up the rage to fight his divorce, but he's shown just passively going along with it. Interesting choice that he's chosen to be the protagonist and the audience point of view. Everything just happens to him. Nothing is actually initiated. From an analysis standpoint, one might infer that Gibson is a representative of the average older conservative man, signified by his beard and the graying hair, to whom the world is incomprehensible. Everything is changing around him and it's scary. This man is henpecked by his ex-wife. He submits to his new girlfriend. He keeps having his catalytic converter stolen. If he's representative of the average conservative man, that man is weak-willed. That man is being humiliated by divorce, by society. The opposite of a traditional idea of what a protagonist is supposed to be. The opposite of an alpha male. Now, Alex Cruz. Well, what to say about them? The entire arc of the character is one that, unintentionally, the writers have set up to be tragic. In the opening flashback, while the entire team is bullying Felix by leaving their towels on his face and over his head, Alex is the only one who doesn't do that. He even offers a small little apology for the actions of their teammates. Alex is clearly being set up to be the example of the confused trans person. The slightly more sensitive man who, through societal pressures, is forced into becoming a woman. And yet, Alex never really fights it. Alex ends up working at the dollhouse because their career as an actor never really took off, and they later admit to Gibson that they enjoy working there. In the first scene where Gibson and Alex are commiserating about their lot in life, Gibson is shown with his wig off, still wearing his wig cap, while Alex has not removed their wig at all. The wig is something that follows Alex around, even when going to register for the first tournament that leads to them being signed up as a trans woman. It might be a signifier of how Alex feels about their gender. And you might note here that I have not been gendering Alex as male, and that is because I am of the opinion that the writers completely unintentionally created a character who is extremely representative of the struggle that a lot of trans people go through when initially trying to accept their identity. Alex has this monologue at the end, or near the climax of the movie, where they basically come out to Gibson, asserting that they believe that they are actually a trans woman.
I am a woman. I mean, all those years playing basketball, I never really felt like myself. A decade in Hollywood trying to figure out who I really was, and then I started working at the dollhouse, and this is the real me, Coach. This is who I am.
But that realization is immediately quashed and rejected. Gibson tells them, you're confused. I'm going to make sure you get conversion therapy immediately. And then proceeds to kick them in the groin to demonstrate their masculinity. Now, having seen enough fights in my life, I know that if you kick a cis woman in the groin, she's probably going to go down too. And why? Because the bladder is in that region? And, when you deliver enough force to the bladder, it kind of causes it to involuntarily open, which is pretty painful in and of itself. And there's a post-credits gag, which features Alex lying on a therapist's couch, talking about their childhood to noted anti-trans psychologist Jordan B. Peterson. Clearly, it seems they took Gibson up on that conversion therapy offer. And therein lies the tragedy of the character. Alex has already had the realization that they are trans and is being violently forced, quite literally in this case, back into the closet. It's a cycle that many trans people, particularly those living in more conservative areas of the United States and the rest of the world, are very familiar with. There are parallels that can be drawn with folks who detransition, whose reasons usually include being unable to afford continuing hormones or such extreme social rejection that they choose to return to their previous gender presentation. It's sad in and of itself. As I was watching this film, the writers chose to have these little moments where Alex is being shown to be enjoying the facade of femininity a little more than they should be. And all I could think to myself was, oh, honey, if you want to transition, you can just do it. You'll be so much happier. And the way that Alex is written, they are the only character that actually has anything resembling growth and a character arc. And that is, again, literally violently cut off. Alex is forced back into the closet and is forced to continue upholding this patriarchal status quo that they find themselves in. Now, Gwen Wilde, the reporter. Yeah, you see, this is another one of those woke modern movies that doesn't really have an explicit antagonist, but Gwen Wilde, she's the character who comes closest to filling that role. She's mercenary, she's totally goal-oriented, she's cold in her pursuits. Basically, she's Hillary Clinton. But seriously, Wilde isn't written so much as a character, but as a means for the writers to vent their frustrations about contemporary society. More than once, Gibson and his crew joke about how Wilde is not to be trusted, since she's a journalist.
And a girlfriend.
She's a journalist. You can't believe anything she says.
Now, there are always reasons to distrust media, but this clearly stems from that right-wing talking point about fake news and how the media is constantly lying to you. Now, that might be true in this particular case, but it's not even true in the framing provided by the film. Wilde is intentionally setting Gibson and his team up to infiltrate women's sports, but that's not the media. It's one woman trying to drum up publicity so that she can ride that to prominence. She is not so much a representative of the media in this case, as she is more akin to James O'Keefe, formerly of Project Veritas, a muckraker. A muckraker who is not interested in truth, but in social media fame and clicks. And social media clout is definitely something that Wilde is chasing. And she's also wildly inconsistently written, which shouldn't be surprising considering the rest of the movie. Let's take an example. Gibson at one point refers to her as his girlfriend, which she immediately shuts down. Yet in a later exchange with his ex-wife, Darby, she easily refers to himself as his girlfriend. Now, you might say that this is a joke, set up to show how women never truly show their feelings except through their contradictory actions. But here's the thing. Wilde never takes any action after to demonstrate that she has feelings for Gibson that she's like hiding or suppressing. It's just a setup for a one-off joke. Wilde constantly repeats that she's only interested in Gibson because he's now a winner. But she never actually sleeps with him either. They engage in some kind of kink roleplay scenario while taking the role of dominant, but actual copulation is never achieved. It's almost as if the writers were trying to depict Wilde as this caricature of the career-driven woman who secretly wants a man to provide her with a genuine relationship, but they couldn't even get that consistent. She only exists to set up jokes and to vomit statistics and information. She has this good 30-second bit where she regurgitates stats about how bad divorce is for children.
Seriously? Of course your divorce is affecting your daughter. 70% of all people in prison come from broken families. She's twice as likely to do drugs, twice as likely to drop out of school, 4 times as likely to have trouble fitting in, 3 times as likely to end up in therapy, twice as likely to commit suicide, 50% more likely to have health problems. Do you people not even do a freaking Google search before you decide to blow up the planet your kids live on?
It doesn't serve any real comedic purpose, but it does allow the writers to get their rant in about how bad divorce is actually. She's given several monologues like this, like one where she talks about how men are the superior of women in every single way. Again, working as the mouthpiece for the writers to get their political takes across. It's interesting that the female characters constantly proclaim their weakness and their subservience to men, and yet Wilde is the character who actually drives the plot. She pushes Gibson to form the team, she sets up opportunities to get them on the news, and she is also the only one shown to have any sort of goal beyond, I just want to vibe, I just want to survive, The rest of the characters are written even more thinly than the main 3. The Crane brothers seem to serve one joke, that they are the twins who run on the same brain cell and they get mad at the lack of imagination the other one shows. David Cohn is there to be the butt of jokes around PTSD. Oh yeah. He's shown to be a prepper living in the wilds of Michigan, in a hut that's surrounded by booby traps because of an incident with the opposing team's mascot back in 2008.
Not after. What was that badger humping? What was that badger humping?
Now that would be funny, except for the fact that there actually are veterans who navigate that kind of mental trauma and they respond in very much the same way, walling themselves off from society and refusing to accept help. I think it's funny that the side who's constantly talking about how we should respect the troops drops that immediately when they get to use them for a punchline. Felix is the nerd who made it big, and yet he's the one who still seeks respect from his old high school bullies. Like, it's like the writers took a look at a list of archetypes and they picked the most common ones. Darby, as Gibson's ex, is also depicted as passive, and yet she clearly exercises more agency than him because she was the one who started seeking the divorce. Winnie, Gibson's daughter, she's here to be the brainwashed child who spouts the woke propaganda being taught to her by her teachers. And yet, this kid actor is delivering these lines with such conviction that I can't help but wonder what she's going to think of this performance 10 years down the line.
We learned all about the Cold War.
Oh, yeah?
Our history teacher led us in a moment of silence for all the workers exploited by the capitalistic system.
Exactly. You're 8 years old.
Okay, boomer.
Chris, played by Matt Walsh, who is given the "and Matt Walsh as" billing, is also another straw man for the writers to just light on fire. Chris is depicted as this consummate liberal. When he's introduced, he's shown meditating, and yet the final scene of the film shows Walsh he's pulling off his wig and commenting snidely to Candace Owens about the importance of his character and what he did.
Another Sweet Daddy Walsh adventure comes to a satisfying conclusion.
What are you talking about? I don't understand how anything you did helped to make this situation better.
Don't you?
It's like somebody saw the Sailor Moon meme and thought like, ooh, I should put that there. But this little scene is, to me, very revealing. Chris's actions are shown to have been disingenuous throughout the entire film. His liberal affectations merely a front to move Gibson towards the right conclusions, portraying himself as so annoying that Gibson has a reason to dislike Chris and every other liberal that he represents. Now, I think it's a demonstration of how the writers of this film, definitely, and conservatives as a whole, in my opinion, see the rest of the world. Nobody can genuinely believe all of this stuff, so they must be lying to further some kind of agenda. And our point of view is the only correct one, and people would just see that if they didn't just lie about it. So then, if that was the case, why did you have to make a whole movie to demonstrate how ridiculous you think trans people are? In a moment where, despite all of the pressure from the right wing, the acceptance for trans and queer people in the United States is at an all-time high and continues to trend upward. It's how they have to make sense of the world by assuming that everybody is as disingenuous and as dishonest as they are. But if your views are the correct ones, as you believe them to be, why do you have to lie and propagandize this much to push them? Now the acting. Jeremy Boring. He's probably the most aptly named actor I have ever encountered. This man has the deadest eyes I have ever seen in a close-up. Even the rousing, inspirational speech that he delivers in the 2008 flashback, it comes across as if he's reading off of cue cards, and his idea of being inspirational was increase the volume that you're speaking at. Of course, when this is the yardstick that everyone else is being measured against, the rest of the performances they basically go downhill from here. It takes a particular kind of mind to be able to both direct and star in your own film, and Boring doesn't quite have it. Boring also is simultaneously the twinkiest actor who I have ever seen who is doing his best to suppress it. It's like he's trying really hard not to lisp. And Boring really does not have any chemistry with Lexi Contursi, who plays Darby. I mean, look at this moment. It looks like she's trying to squeeze out of his arms. Now, the Crane brothers, they have this little moment in the 2008 flashback where they go on this little outburst of like simultaneous exclamations at each other, and you can absolutely see the beat where they were both counting to get the start of it right.
Damn! She isn't into you! No! She's into you!
Look at that. See, it makes it look like they didn't rehearse it enough. Oh my God. Matt Walsh as Chris is something else. Walsh tweeted that he needed to dig deep in order to play Chris. I think his idea of depth comes from, I don't know, swimming in the kiddie pool, because this is some of the most unconvincing acting I have ever seen. Like, you can just see how checked out he is in this scene. Like, he's reciting lines that he knows are ridiculous, and he can't wait to be done with them. You know, of course, the movie has this meta joke at the end where Chris is shown to be a character played by Walsh, but I don't think you can cover up bad acting by just referencing the fact that we just watched you play a character. The lack of sincerity comes through here so clearly. Okay, acting 101. In acting, one of the most basic tools one can use is the magic if, that was codified by Konstantin Stanislavski, who's considered to be the father of naturalism. The magic if is a simple way to get yourself into character. You know, by asking yourself, how would I behave if I were placed in these specific given circumstances? So, for instance, if you were playing Hamlet, you might start with, how would I behave if I were 17, just got home from college, and I found out my dad died and my mom is sleeping with my uncle? Okay? So, Walsh shows just how incapable of empathy he is. He can't even ask himself, you know, how would I behave if I were the kind of person, you know, the kind of liberal who sincerely believed these things. You know, it needs to be couched in this layer of irony and meta humor in order to mask the fact that he literally is unable to imagine himself as anything but himself. That is not the mentality that makes a great actor. Almost everybody in the cast has this problem. It's like their idea of what acting is getting into costume, saying their lines, getting them right, and calling it a day. Like, there's no interest in the craft. Getting into character, doing research, you know, understanding and developing empathy for the person you're supposed to be portraying, none of that is there. So there's this famous quote that is attributed to Alan Rickman that reads, I don't play villains, I play very interesting people. Now that in and of itself demonstrates the mindset you have to have in order to be an actor. You know, no one who is a villain thinks of themselves as a villain. You have to be able to get into the head of whomever you're portraying, or you won't be able to give a truthful performance. You have to have a certain amount of empathy to be able to connect with someone who is not you, and yet be able to portray them convincingly. You know, I would say that this is what the entire cast lacks as a whole. None of the actors seem super interested in interrogating who their characters are, what their relationships towards the world are. None of that. Now, one might argue that a comedy doesn't call for that level of artistic rigor, but I say, if you can't even bring that sense of honesty and truthfulness to this, how are you supposed to do any kind of higher drama or so-called serious acting? Like, time and time again, actors known for being comedians demonstrate their ability to extend beyond what we think of as unserious acting. Robin Williams, Jim Carrey, Will Smith, all of these people have their roots doing comedy, and yet they've also given numerous award-winning turns in dramas. It is symptomatic of the culture that the Daily Wire has surrounding their productions, and I do not think they take their dedication to the craft very seriously. Ultimately, they know that they are producing propaganda at the end of the day, and they know that however much they posture about it, this is not a comedy. It's an ideologically driven diatribe against trans people. And so that truth keeps finding ways to slip through the work the actors are trying to do. I'm not going to get too in-depth into theories of acting here, but I do believe that on some level, the actors who want to consider themselves actors know that doing this film is not something that they'd be proud to have on their resumes. And that kind of just bleeds into the performance. You know, the Daily Wire is famously populated with actors who weren't able to make it in film or theater. So they've given that up, and this is their attempt to fill that void. All right, let's talk themes. This movie bills itself as a comedy. It isn't. It is a propaganda piece filled with takedowns of every single right-wing grievance that they've made up since the culture wars started being directed towards trans people. And more besides. Like, almost every other scene is a reference to, or, you know, answer to, rebuttal to some kind of imagined boogeyman. You know, Jeremy Boring. Jeremy Boring. So hard to say that fucking name. Director, star of his own movie, who also has a co-writing credit on it, seems to have an especially pronounced hatred of Dylan Mulvaney in particular. I noticed at least 3 scenes that were extended parodies of her Days of Girlhood TikTok series, and the entire movie is filled with scenes like this. For some of them, you would have to be terminally online to specifically understand what it is that they're being mad about. And I unfortunately am terminally online. The reporter, Wild, again, she has this extended sequence where she just spouts off statistics about how bad divorce is for children. You know, almost as if they felt the need to squeeze every single talking point they could possibly fit into it. The Crane brothers sleep with one of the female athletes they're competing against, and they both impregnate her after one night of coitus. And they immediately get treated to a quotation of Deuteronomy 5:9.
And the sins of the father will be visited upon the son even until the 3rd and 4th generations.
As if the audience needs to be reminded that the Lord does not appreciate intercourse outside of wedlock. You know? And all right, next, the entire film is the very epitome of making up a guy to get mad at. The film's entire thesis is that trans women should not be playing women's sports. However, none of the characters are actually trans, with the potential exception of Alex. None of the characters are at any point shown taking HRT or undergoing any kind of medical or surgical intervention to confirm their gender identities. Now, maybe they didn't know, but sporting organizations have very strict rules about whom they allow to compete in the gendered categories. The Olympics, for example, subject their women athletes to rigorous hormonal level testing. And trans women are not allowed to compete unless they have 1, declared their gender for at least 4 years, and 2, demonstrated a testosterone level of less than 10 nanomoles per liter for at least 1 year prior to competing and during the entire period of competition. So maybe the Daily Wire folks weren't aware of that, right? Of course they were! This is a video clip where Ben Shapiro, one of the Daily Wire founders, literally says that they had intended to film the movie as a documentary, except for the fact that none of the sports leagues would allow their actors to compete with the women unless they'd undergone at least a year of hormone replacement therapy.
Now, to be fair, I think I'd actually suggested to the Crane boys that they do this as a doc.
Yes.
I originally went to them and I said, you guys should go try out for a bunch of ladies' leagues. And that became not possible because, as it turns out, most ladies' leagues don't allow in actual men. And they weren't willing to go the full distance in terms of what it would require in order to, the actual hormone treatments and everything to play in some of the ladies' leagues.
the very scenario that the Daily Wire is attempting to lampoon and satirize literally does not exist and cannot exist, even by their own admission. And of course, that brings us to the next point. The makers of this film clearly only see trans women as men who dress as women, so as to gain access to women's spaces and to rob women of the accolades they cannot achieve, as, in their own words, mediocre men. Yet this is refuted by the text of their own film. The film attempts to conflate trans women who medically transition with those who do not, and posits that trans women who are not on HRT would be allowed to compete against cis women. Yet they know this is not true. And one of the sneaky little sleights of hand that they pull while attempting to buttress their argument is this thing. Their team, the Lady Ballers, do not even attempt to present convincingly as female, either on the court or off the court. And the viewer is constantly reminded of the fact that these are cis men who are dressing as women, which reaffirms the creator's own perceptions of what trans women are. Out here in the real world, the vast majority of trans women who can afford to usually transition medically as well as socially. They have to live as women 24/7. They take HRT by means of the injection or pills, and they have to deal with the kinds of people who treat them as lesser men on top of that. If this were indeed a film that was interested in comedically portraying the so-called dangerous trans women pose, why not actually show the characters medically transitioning? Since the producers clearly believe the advantages a testosterone-based puberty confers upon trans women are not negated by the process of undergoing HRT, why not have a sequence where the team actually does take hormones? Because despite all of the guff and the noise, the Daily Wire people know that there is a clear difference between trans women and cis men. Actually showing the characters undergoing some kind of hormone regimen would undercut the point that they were trying to make. Reams and reams of research exists on this subject, but suffice it to say that estrogen-based HRT does noticeably produce a reduction in things like strength, and fat mass, and muscle mass. But I can hear you saying, this is a comedy! Things have to be exaggerated for the sake of humor. My answer is yes, but there at least has to be some grain of truth. The entire premise that this film is founded on is the idea that men are infiltrating women's sports by posing as trans women. And that is simply untrue. Again, even the production company knows this. That's why they had to make it a fictional movie, because they couldn't make it a documentary. Thematically, this entire film is as confused as they claim trans women are. So the opening flashback set in 2008 frames Coach Rob Gibson and his boys as terrible people. The team bullies their towel boy. They get into fights over the smallest of disagreements. Peak humor is watching the two Crane brothers choke each other out on the floor. And yet they are our protagonists, and the viewer's sympathies tend to follow the protagonists. And then the film then shows them engaging in what are supposed to be violations of women's spaces, which the film and its makers clearly disapprove of. So why then even make the attempt to have the audience sympathize with them? Why not just commit to having the Lady Ballers as out-and-out creeps who are only interested in the fame and fortune posing as trans women apparently brings to you? The film shows all of the members of the team as washed-up, jaded former high school stars who have not done anything with their lives with the exception of Felix, the towel boy. The film itself does not have a clear stance on what we are actually supposed to feel about them. Are we supposed to feel disgust for the Lady Ballers as they brutalize some of their female competitors? Are we supposed to laugh at how these women are being physically pummeled by these men dressed as women? Is the joke simply that the men are dressed as women? The film seems to be of the opinion that what Gibson's boys are doing is bad, and yet the montage of their rise to fame is set to triumphant, upbeat music, as every inspirational sports movie does, while they demolish every single woman that they compete against. It's a clear lack of directorial intention. One can still present something in a negative light while still framing it as humorous. And this entire film is rife with the same problem. Are we supposed to pity Gibson for the fact that he's getting divorced? Or are we supposed to look down upon him for allowing the divorce to even happen to him? Alex Cruz is another interesting example. As I mentioned earlier, Cruz keeps hinting at the fact that they might actually be trans, and at the climax says so to Gibson before being snapped out of it by an inspirational pep talk and knee to the groin. The film presents Cruz's gender confusion as a source of humor. But I can't help but note that every time the character is shown presenting as female, they always seem to be much happier. Again, this is another storytelling issue. The script seems intent to show that Cruz is merely confused, and that a hard slap of reality will change that, which is what they believe about all trans people. Cruz represents what they wish they could do to all trans people, to either shame them out of their transition or physically assault them into accepting their assigned gender. The fact that they still have to undergo conversion therapy in this post-credits scene to maintain that acceptance of their assigned gender is an involuntary acceptance from the writers that they know this desistance is a flimsy pretense that must be maintained through constant societal pressure. Now, the entire film seems to be an excuse for the Daily Wire team to live out their dreams of being movie stars and film people. We all know Ben Shapiro wasn't able to make it in Hollywood as a writer, and Michael Knowles, who famously called for the genocide of trans people, who is appearing as yet another reporter in this thing, actually portrayed a young gay man on screen in a student film. Now, anyone who's ever been on a film set or shoot can tell you, you spend hours on end standing and waiting around in costume and makeup to shoot maybe 3 minutes of footage. Those actors decided to sign up for a job that would require them to wear wigs and makeup and stay dressed like that for extended periods of time. Now, I can't even claim to know the thought process of these performers, but I think it's rather telling that they all kind of seem to be enjoying themselves while doing that bare minimum of wearing wigs and lipstick. It's almost a running joke that these conservative performers take every opportunity to dress in drag or to cross-dress that they can. Every accusation is projection. So conservative Daily Wire hosts Brett Cooper and Michael Knowles, as I mentioned, appear as reporters throughout the film. And Jesus, I could not help but wonder, how much did they want to darken their skin for this shot? Just, ew. And the film is open, just completely open in its other forms of bigotry. Gibson is fired from his job as a high school coach in 2023 for accusing a black student of his for stealing his catalytic converter, which the student has actually done. And the team at the climax that trounces the Lady Ballers is composed entirely of black men, because apparently black people can either be criminals or play basketball. It's just so egregious and blatant. There are bad movies and bad movies. There are the kinds of bad movies that you get together and laugh with your friends about, and the kinds of bad movies that are a slog. This was one of those. The film wants to be dark and edgy, about how cool its humor is, and yet still wants to express its, siding with traditional family values. Like this moment when Gibson gives his daughter a monologue about how women are just innately better caregivers and they're much better communicators and they're so much better at nurturing.
Listen, women are better at all kinds of things. They can be nurturing and sensitive and empathetic, better at doing lots of things at once and caring for a lot of people at once. They're better at communicating and building community, and they civilize men.
When it's not trying to be funny, it just starts to preach at you. And I mean that literally. You got the monologue about how divorce is evil, the stay-at-home speech. It feels like they needed to put their morals out front and center so that people would know. Even though we kept cross-dressing for this, we do think that it's bad, for real, honest. The film attempts to capitalize on the culture war narrative that has been stoked up around trans people, thanks to, in no small part, a lot of the faces who appear in this film. Matt Walsh, who plays Chris, is also infamous for his anti-trans hit piece, What is a Woman? The film wants to take the stance that the whole trans women in sports issue is fake, in this case literally created by Gwen Wild, and I think that's kind of telling in and of itself. Wild manufactures the rise of the lady ballers, and so too has right-wing media manufactured the controversy surrounding trans women athletes. They even had a whole joke about how nobody watches women's sports.
It's ladies basketball, boys. Nobody watches.
The fact that the instigator of the events of the plot is a journalist is not lost, and there seems to be a certain amount of projection. Right-wing outlets like the Daily Wire have received a lot of money from dubious sources, and they constantly have their talking points synchronized to a T. And I think there might be a little bit of an admission here, disguised under all of the jokes, that the media circus surrounding trans women athletes is just that, a manufactured controversy meant to stir up their base and generate clicks. One also cannot talk about the film without mentioning the fact that the Daily Wire had to lie and misrepresent itself in order to get people to act as extras for their crowd scenes. Here's a quote from the Nashville scene. Quote, "During a break from filming, several actors voiced their objections and were screaming about Daily Wire's involvement with the film before being escorted out of the building. Some extras noted their objections. Certain costume elements and props, such as wigs and a sign reading Baller Pride with a trans flag, were removed in what appeared to be an effort to downplay or hide the content or plot of the film." End quote. I think if you have to actively try to downplay what your film is about in order to get people to appear as extras, your film is being deliberately provocative. Up here is a screenshot of a text sent to the Tennessee Holler. Caption reads, quote, "Seems the Daily Wire is shooting an anti-trans film at Municipal Auditorium. Security outside told us it's a basketball comedy. Some extras are showing up without knowing what it is. One tells us it was vile and they felt unsafe and left." End quote. Ultimately, not a very good film. It doesn't know what it wants to say, and it doesn't know how to say it. All it does know is that it hates trans people. And yet, not a single person, other than Alex, is explicitly depicted as trans or transitioning or even considering it. One has to wonder, how much hate do you have to have in your heart to think, I'm going to make a movie that ridicules a group that you don't even have the guts to portray on screen? The storytelling is confused and inconsistent. There's no thematic through line. The film ostensibly wants to defend women and yet ridicules them in the most misogynist manner. The Daily Wire wants to frame itself as edgy and pushing the boundaries of comedy, but can't even come out and tell the extras the truth about the film that they're making. I pointed out earlier that I believe the character of Chris is representative of how conservatives view the rest of humanity. Everyone's beliefs are wrong, and nobody can believe this stuff genuinely anyways, so all we need to do is lie, and then they'll move over to our way of thinking. That is the thesis of this entire film. The film lies about the nature of trans athletes, it lies about its political opponents, and the production team had to lie in order to get people to even appear in it. At what point do you take a step back and ask yourself, why do we have to keep lying in order to achieve our aims? Why are our views so unpopular? Why do we always feel like our beliefs in the minority? Even though we keep telling ourselves they must be in the majority. But this is a level of introspection that the film doesn't even aspire to, let alone reach. And the only character who actually does some amount of introspection has it knocked out of them literally by a knee to the groin. If there's anything that I can end this on, I hope that every single person associated with this production makes many more films with the Daily Wire. May all their careers be so shiningly defined. It stinks.